The following lesson is linked to Learning Outcome 4, Language, and addresses the assessment standard that requires learners to use simple sentences appropriately and correctly, and construct acceptable compound and complex sentences by using clauses, phrases, and conjunctions.
Hi guys, we are working on developing skills that will help you to put words together like the finely tuned engine of a sports car. In today's lesson, I have some more tools that will help you to tune your English language, so let's get a move on. In our previous lesson, we learned the following. A phrase is a group of words with no finite verb that acts like a part of speech. Now let's look at a group of words that includes a finite verb, the clause. By the end of this lesson, you should be able to identify a clause and understand the function of clauses. But before we start, let's take one step back and recap. In order to find clauses, we need to be sure what a sentence is. Can you remember what a sentence is? A sentence is a group of words which expresses one complete thought. And don't forget, every sentence must contain a finite verb. Okay, so that's a sentence. Here is an example. I am your presenter. Am is a finite verb. It expresses one complete thought, that I am here to present to you. That makes it a full sentence. Now, what's a clause? A clause is a group of words which contains a finite verb. A clause conveys a single idea. So what do you notice about the definition of a sentence and the definition of a clause? Did you see how a clause and a sentence could be the same? Every sentence and every clause must contain a finite verb. So what makes them different? Why would we call one a sentence and one a clause? Hang on. By the end of the lesson, this should all be clear. But for now, the first point is that a sentence may contain more than one finite verb, whereas a clause will contain only one finite verb. This is a key point. Don't forget it. Every sentence has at least one clause. Let's look at an example of a sentence with one clause. Mapitso opened the car boot. First of all, we need to look for the finite verb. Here it is. Opened. It is a finite verb because it has a subject, Mapitsu, and it has tense. This happened in the past. Because there is one finite verb in this sentence, there is one clause. To make this sentence a little more lively and interesting, we could add some extra spice. We could say the following. Mapitso opened the car boot with her key. The phrase, with her key, tells us more about how Mapitso opened the boot. But this is a phrase, not a clause, because there is no finite verb in the group of words with her key. Even though we have a bit more detail, the sentence still only has one finite verb, opened. So it still only has one clause, what we call a main clause. Let's add even more detail to this sentence. Full of smiles, Mapitso opened the car boot with her key. Full of smiles. Now we know how she felt and how she acted, but the sentence still only has one finite verb and one clause. It has one subject, Mapitsu, and one verb, opened. It has one adverbial phrase telling us how she acted and one adjectival phrase telling us how she looked. But what about a sentence that has more than one finite verb? Let's take a look at a sentence with two finite verbs. Now, if a sentence has two finite verbs, how many clauses would it have? If you guess 2, well done. I pulled into the garage and Jabu filled my tank. First, we look for the finite verbs. Can you find them? The verbs are pulled and filled. These are all finite verbs as each of them has a subject, I and Jabu, and it has a tense. The actions happened in the past. There are 2 clauses in this sentence. They are, I pulled into the garage and Jabu filled my tank. Let's find some more clauses. Pick out the finite verbs and then work out the number of clauses in this sentence. The first verb is walked and the next one is gave. If there are 2 finite verbs in one sentence, how many clauses are there? I hope that you were thinking that there are 2 clauses. So what are the clauses? The mechanic in blue overalls walked over to us and gave us his advice. Are you getting the hang of it? Here is another one. See if you can spot the clauses. Again, the first thing we need to do is to find the finite verbs. They are started and checked. 2 finite verbs means 2 clauses. Now let's work out what the 2 clauses are. Here they are. Before I started the car, I checked the petrol. Both clauses form one sentence. I think we've got our minds around how to spot clauses, so let's move on. We are going to look at the different types of clauses that you get. Let's look at this sentence again. Can you see that one clause makes sense on its own, but not the other? Just reading, before I started the car, makes you think, hey, something is missing, isn't it? But I checked the petrol sounds fine on its own. That's because it's the main clause. The clause, before I started the car, depends on the other clause, I checked the petrol, for it to make sense. This type of clause is known as a subordinate clause. Subordinate. Sub means under or lesser, while ordinate refers to position. A subordinate clause is never as important as the main clause. A main clause is one which can stand on its own and make sense. And a subordinate clause usually provides more information about the main clause and is dependent on the main clause for meaning. Think of a car with a trailer. A subordinate clause is a bit like a trailer at the back of the car. It swings along going where the car goes. It depends on the car and can't travel alone. The trailer is subordinate to the car, like the subordinate clause is to the main clause. So to recap, what is the one thing that sentences and clauses have in common? Every sentence must contain a finite verb, and every clause must contain a finite verb. And the difference between a main clause and a subordinate clause is that a main clause can stand on its own and make sense, but a subordinate clause relies on the main clause for its meaning. Now let's work through this activity. See if you can separate the main clause from the subordinate clause in the following sentences. Although I had no money, I went to the shop next door. The driver who caused the accident told the passengers to keep quiet. Okay, let's go through the sentences one by one together. If you are viewing this on tape, now is a good time to stop the tape and work through the examples. Although I had no money, I went to the shop next door. First, let's find the finite verbs. In this sentence, the verbs are had and went. There are 2 finite verbs, which means that there are 2 clauses. Now we need to decide if one clause can make sense on its own. What do you think? Well, one clause is, although I had no money, and the other is, I went to the shop next door. Quite clearly, the clause, I went to the shop next door, makes sense on its own. So that is the main clause in this sentence. The clause, although I had no money, depends on the rest of the sentence for it to make sense. We could not use it as a separate sentence, so it must be the subordinate clause. Now the last example. The driver who caused the accident told the passengers to keep quiet. Can you find the finite verbs? They are caused and told. If there are two finite verbs, how many clauses are there? That's right, 2 clauses. Now let's split the sentence into clauses. In this sentence, it's a little bit tricky because one clause is in the middle of the other. But the commas will help us to sort out and keep the subject with the finite verb. The driver told the passengers to keep quiet is the first clause, and who caused the accident is the second clause. Now, can you spot the main clause? If you identified it as the driver told the passengers to keep quiet, you can be proud of yourself. In this case, the subordinate clause was in the middle of the main clause. Who caused the accident is a clause, but it can't stand on its own. In this sentence, it tells us more about the driver. Here is a tip that can help you spot subordinate clauses. Subordinate clauses are often separated from the main clause with a comma. Up until now, we've been looking at rather long sentences and splitting them up into different clauses. For some fun, let's try it the other way around. Let's look at some short sentences and see if we can combine them into longer, slightly more interesting sentences. Here we have 4 simple sentences, each of which contains a finite verb. Our task is to combine it into one sentence. Can you work out how to do this? Here is how I combine the sentences. We bought a second-hand car, guaranteed for 1 year, for 10,000 Rand from Great Deal Car Mart. Now that wasn't too tricky, was it? And it sounds better than a string of short sentences, don't you think? Of course, I've lost some of the clauses because I had to drop some of the verbs. Well, we can't have everything. Here is today's task. Let's see if you can combine the following sentences into one long sentence. A space probe is orbiting Mars. It has photographed a volcano. The volcano has a base 800 kilometers broad. It is twice the size of any volcano on Earth. Another little tip. You can use conjunctions. Remember those little joining words like and but to string short sentences together. I know some people who do that all the time and they never seem to get to the end of their sentences. I think we've covered clauses now. If you want more practice, go to Mindset Learn website and try the examples there, or ask your teacher for more sentences to practice on. Another game is to find sentences in magazines or newspapers and analyze them. This could keep you busy for hours. Now you are nearly halfway through our effective grammar module and well on your way to being masters of effective grammar. Thanks for joining me today, and bye for now.